Do join us for the second lecture in the three-part lecture series delivered by Tony Badger, Professor of American History at Northumbria University. He is speaking on why white liberals fail, Southern Politicians and Race, 1933-2018, and that will be at 4 o'clock here in this room. Next week's colloquium will be delivered by fellow Mary Hicks, and she'll be speaking on Africa, Brazil, Black mariners, and the world of South Atlantic slavery. Now please welcome to the podium Professor Evelyn Higginbotham, Professor of African and African American Studies, as well as Chair of the History Department here at Harvard.
Well, welcome to the Du Bois Colloquium. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jarvis R. Givens, who is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and he's also currently the Suzanne Young Murray Assistant Professor at the Radcliffe Institute. Jarvis Givens received his PhD in African Diaspora Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and he initially came to Harvard in 2016 as a Dean's Postdoctoral Fellow at the Graduate School of Education. His scholarship on African American educational history in the 19th and 20th centuries has brought visibility to the rich archives of Black teachers' associations, and he has found new voices and stories within those archives. Through a theoretical analysis of race and schooling, Jarvis Givens' historical work informs studies of contemporary urban schooling and its efforts to recruit and retain African American educators. Givens has published in a variety of journals: Race, Ethnicity, and Education, Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, Culture and Society, and the Harvard Educational Review. His book, Schooling in Forbidden Fields, Carter G. Woodson and the Demands of Black Education, is forthcoming from Harvard University Press. By examining Carter Woodson, who graduated from Harvard's History Department in 1912 and went on to renown as the father of Black history, Jarvis critiques larger themes related to the history of race, power, and the American school. Jarvis Givens tells the story of Woodson's Black history movement in a new and exciting way, since he focuses on Woodson's relationship to elementary and secondary school teachers, and he identifies and analyzes the way those teachers put Woodson's ideas and materials into practice during the era of Jim Crow. And this topic, as Jarvis knows, has special meaning to me since my own father was one of those very school teachers who worked with Carter G. Woodson to pursue what Jarvis identifies as a subversive pedagogy. And so we look forward to hearing Jarvis speak to us today on fugitive pedagogy in the Jim Crow classroom, the case of Carter G. Woodson.
Hello, everyone. First, I want to say thank you so much to Professor Higginbotham for that generous introduction, and also for your continued mentorship since I came here as a postdoc and matriculating onto the faculty. It's been very supportive of my work throughout the entire time, as well as providing stellar leadership to ASALA, the organization that Woodson founded, which is very much at the center of the story that I'm going to be sharing today. Also want to say thank you to Professor Gates and the Hutchins Center for inviting me to share my work in this space. This is the first time, I think, since I've been here that I've shared anything related to my research outside of the School of Education, and I think it's a very fitting forum, given the work that I'm doing. Thanks. So, I'm excited to share this talk entitled Fugitive Pedagogy in the Jim Crow Classroom, the case of Carter G. Woodson. And as it was mentioned, I'm going to be doing kind of dive into the book that I'm currently putting closure on, around Carter G. Woodson's educational philosophy and his partnership with Black teachers. And so I encountered a problem some years ago that will forever alter the trajectory of my research on education in Black life. As a graduate student at UC Berkeley, I came across a footnoted reference to Carter G. Woodson's school textbooks, one of which you see here pictured on the screen being read by a group of junior high students in the 1930s. I was aware that Woodson had played a central role in African American studies, but I was shocked to learn about the size of his impact on educational practice during Jim Crow in the private spaces of Black teachers' classrooms. Born to former slaves toward the end of Reconstruction, Woodson later received a master's degree from the University of Chicago and became the second Black PhD from Harvard in 1912 after W.B. Du Bois, who was the first. Woodson founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915 and Negro History Week in 1926, which we know today as Black History Month. In 1933, he published The Miseducation of the Negro, an early contribution to the study of Black psychic and social life. These and other contributions have earned him the affectionate title, as you just previously heard, as the father of Black history. And despite his fame as a historian, however, Woodson's career as an educator has often been overlooked. Yet he was fully immersed in the world of Black teachers until his death in 1950, just before the landmark ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education. And during those years, he published 7 textbooks that widely circulated amongst Black teachers. He developed magazines, alternative lesson plans, and classroom decorations for Black teachers and students. And by 1931, over 80% of Black high schools were actively celebrating Negro History Week. All of these things placed him squarely at the crossroads of education and Black life. But surprisingly, Woodson's long career as a school teacher and his close partnership with Black Teachers Association are only mentioned in passing, if at all. And as you can see by the documents on the screen, Woodson was a life member of the National Black Teachers Association, which was the ATA, and he also was a regular speaker and member at the state level conferences of Black teachers across the South, up and throughout the duration of his career. So I was wondered about how it was that someone who Black teachers themselves referred to as, quote, a schoolmaster to his race, could be so understudied in the history of education. So my current book project, Schooling in Forbidden Fields, Carter G. Woodson and the Demands of Black Education, traces Woodson's contributions to educational theory and practice. And while Woodson is the principal character of my book, I'm mostly interested in the educational life world around him. The people that taught him, the groups his ideas traveled through, the teachers who used his curriculum materials, and the students who reflected on his impact in their schools. Tracking Woodson through these dynamic threads in the history of African American education reveals with an unrelenting clarity that at its highest calling, the objective of Black education was and continues to be inherently subversive. Writing about the development of Black education in the late 19th century, Woodson offered the following, quote, starting out after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided to work out a program which would enslave the Negro's mind inasmuch as the freedom of body had to be conceded, end quote. Here, Woodson urges us to consider that the political conflicts at the core of Black education were fundamentally linked to the legacies and social technologies of enslavement. He anticipates Saidiya Hartman's assertion that the linear progress narrative of slavery to freedom, breaks down when we look at the material and social political conditions of Black life after the non-event of emancipation. I reconsider Black education in the post-Civil War era as intimately situated in what Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, or what Woodson himself termed as, quote unquote, the sequel to slavery. So my talk today will stage 3 key scenarios from my book in 3 acts. And my use of theatrical metaphors, I should say, points to my methodology, which draws on insights from performance studies to read archival materials. My research attends to the rare moments where Black teachers and students enter the historical record. These moments are critical for attending to the human experience at the center of the story. This pushes me to pause with key scenarios, picking apart personas, objects, and gestures hidden in context. This is a refusal of quick narration, a reading between the lines and through the silences in the archival transcript, an attention to emotions, affect, in social historical constructions of power that informed everyday moments of Black life. Understanding Woodson and his network offers theoretical and practical resources for educators today, not only for those who teach Black and brown students, but also for those who feel that in the current political climate, our teaching has become a fugitive project. So now that the stage has been set, so to speak, I'll begin with the first act, which I am calling First Encounters. Black education was a fugitive project from its inception. Woodson's home state of Virginia passed anti-literacy laws as early as 1819. This legal precedent was reinforced through subsequent acts leading up to emancipation. For instance, an act passed in April 1831 declared the following: all meetings of free Negroes or mulattoes at any schoolhouse, church, meeting house, or other place for teaching them reading or writing, either in the day or night, under whatever pretext, shall be deemed and considered as an unlawful assembly, end quote. The act then authorized whippings, quote, at the discretion of any justice of the peace, not exceeding 20 lashes, end quote. Anti-literacy laws enforced the idea that Blacks were outside the social contract of American society and therefore inconceivable as human or citizen. Many enslaved people subverted this prohibition by acquiring literacy through fugitive tactics. And when the Civil War began, African Americans challenged this legal mandate at full speed. It was Jubilee, some said. No longer enslaved, Black people across the South performed their first acts of freedom by occupying the classroom. Recalling the first days of emancipation in the state of Virginia, Booker T. Washington wrote the following, quote, it was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none were too old. As fast as any kind of teacher could be secured, not only were the day schools filled, but the night schools as well, end quote. Woodson relayed a similar narrative about his uncles, John and James Riddle, who rushed to the freedmen's school after the general emancipation. He proudly recalled that Uncle John was the first Black person in Buckingham County, Virginia, to secure a first-class teaching certificate. These two men were the brothers of Woodson's mother, Anne Eliza Riddle, and would eventually become his first teachers in a one-room schoolhouse. This familial narrative warrants further scrutiny to fully appreciate the learning that took place in Woodson's first classroom in the 1880s, where these freed men taught the first generation of children born on the other side of slavery. I should say this image here is, to my knowledge, the earliest picture that we have of Carter G. Woodson, and it's not from this first school, but it's the second school he would attend where his cousin was the principal, Carter Burnett, who you see to the far right, and Woodson is in the top to the right. But I'm still using this image because I think it's important to place him in this early context of Black education, and also to think about his familial narrative that kind of surrounds this early educational experience of his. Anne Riddle, Woodson's mother, was 11 years old when she pleaded to be sold instead of her mother and younger siblings. Perhaps if she could entice a high enough bid, her financially challenged master would avoid splitting up what remained of her family. This was the prayer she clung to as she journeyed to the auction block in Richmond, Virginia. In speaking to Woodson in his youth, Anne recounted how she, in shackles, passed before the statue of George Washington on a horse, pointing to the South. The enslaved interpreted this posture to be President Washington's, quote, command to carry the Negroes down south, end quote. The bids placed for Anne's purchase were too low, and instead her mother and two youngest brothers were sold at the price of $1,900. So standing before Woodson in the one-room schoolhouse was one uncle that had been sold with his grandmother and his eldest uncle who remained on the plantation with Woodson's mother. Here lies Woodson's first encounter with the project of Black education. His first teachers were former slaves. Whether or not it was true that the stone representation of Washington signaled the direction and fate of Black life, Anne's recalling of this experience to her son as a defining moment for she and her brothers was encoded with important lessons. In this moment, we have a monumental representation of the nation casting a shadow over their worlds. and the enslaved people's comprehension of this statute as illustrative of slavery's violent intrusion on black sociality. Anne passed by the Washington statue in chains with a coerced willingness to sell herself. The lack of protection that triangulates between Anne's decision, the representation of the first US president, and the sale of her brothers and mother was knowledge embedded in context. Stories that shaped Woodson's deference to his first teachers. There's a striking intimacy between the home and the schoolhouse in this case. The presence of Woodson's first teachers is not a fact to be glossed over, I offer. They are not decorative detail or just names in the narrative. We must understand their bodies as meaning in motion, their once flesh as commodity subjectivities, once property now working to be in possession of their persons, communicated a sort of embodied knowledge to their students. Woodson's first teachers helped him become, as he put it, quote, well-grounded in the fundamentals, end quote. These fundamentals meant more than simply reading, writing, and arithmetic, I would offer. These men, in their flesh, embodied the fugitive practice that was at the center of black education from its inception. Teaching for these formerly enslaved brothers was an act of unmaking the terms of their relation to both the word and world, challenging a knowledge system that defined them as beneath the threshold of human history, disrupting a social order that functioned on these anti-black ideas. Woodson's first encounters alongside the broader historiography of African American education during the 19th century has led me to conceptualize the overarching historical framework of my book, what I have come to call Black educational heritage. Black educational heritage names the dialectic between anti-black exclusion and confinement in the American school, and how these technologies of control demanded black fugitive practices of learning. And I'll now take some time to unpack this framework through a cursory reading of black education in the 19th century, but with an eye toward this narrative that I've just shared about Woodson and his early educational encounters. So starting with the Common School movement and anti-literacy laws in the first half of the 1800s, black Americans were excluded from the citizenship goals of education. With this social experiment sought to establish a common national identity amongst white Americans, thus fortifying the pillars of the Republic, and African Americans were violently excluded from said program. They were rendered non-human, non-citizen, and therefore illegible as students. This was an early manifestation of anti-black exclusion in the American schooling project. Recall here the Virginia law that I mentioned earlier that made black literacy a punishable offense. As black education became gradually permissible in the post-Civil War era, however, the American schooling experiment simply included blacks in a way that aligned with the racial hierarchy that was reminiscent of the slavery period. African Americans were included in the project of the American school through practices of anti-black confinement. This practice was legislated through Roberts versus the City of Boston in 1850, and subsequently with the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Anti-black confinement is most immediately captured through what we recall as separate and unequal. Black students were rendered a hybrid of citizen and non-citizen, a sub-student, if you will. These ideas became increasingly justified by emerging social science literature during the progressive era of the late 19th and early 20th century, a body of scholarship that pathologized black people as culturally inept. These ideas were taken up by a group of industrial philanthropists and educational leaders who the historian Bill Watkins has referred to as, quote, the white architects of black education. They used these ideas to justify excluding blacks from particular levels of schooling, as well as confining them to certain kinds of education. And here I'm signaling the kind of iconic narrative that many of us may be familiar with that's often represented between the debate with Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, which is a misnaming of that tension in the history of African American education. I can talk more about that later. It's more so a narrative of white philanthropy manipulating the direction of black education during this period. And so naming it the debate between Du Bois and Washington it obscures that reality. And we can talk, as I said, we can talk more about that if anyone's interested. So these ideas of exclusion and confinement were not limited to the material realm. For instance, anti-Black exclusion meant more than Black bodies being shoved from physical school structures. Epistemologically speaking, Black exclusion also translated to their exorcism from human history. When they were represented in knowledge in school curricula, these representations were confined to stereotypes that reified the racial hierarchy of white supremacy. This global political system required the exclusion of Black people from modern understandings of the human. It required their confinement to representations that defined them as the antithesis of the reasoning, rational subject. And so I read these two strands of anti-Black racism in the American school, that is, exclusion and confinement, in their collapsed form as educational quarantine. This layered function of educational quarantine was a key component of Black people's experiences in the American school since its common school origins. And I should say, I'm intentionally using scientific nomenclature because of the fact that educational policy is being formed by the pseudoscientific literature that's coming out during this time period. So this idea of quarantine is very much so appropriate when we look at the exchange between social science literature that's coming out, the way that it's being taken up by leading white educational leaders who are shaping educational policy, particularly for Blacks in the South during this time period. This layered function of educational quarantine was a key component of Black people's experiences in the American school since its common school origins. And Black people were well aware of these antagonisms. As early as the 19th century, African Americans, enslaved or otherwise, cultivated a dynamic politic of education. They realized that any education in service to Black freedom dreams would require constant acts of subversion. So just as it was necessary for enslaved people to steal away at night to acquire literacy, after emancipation, Black people continued to acquire critical aspects of their education in secrecy and through subversive tactics. This has become the through line of my research program, extracting a history of fugitive practice from the archival transcript of Black education. And Woodson's first teachers, I should say, are a textbook example of these fugitive demands. A key moment in Woodson's own writing turned to the fugitive learning practices of enslaved Blacks. He wrote the following to students and teachers in his first textbook, The Negro in Our History. And Woodson writes, quote, "How some of these slaves learned in spite of opposition makes a beautiful story. Knowing the value of learning as a means of escape and having longing for it too because it was forbidden, many slaves continued their education under adverse circumstances," end quote. Woodson signals the dialectic I have referred to as Black educational heritage. He conjures the entanglement of educational quarantine and enslaved people's steady practice of, quote, learning as a means of escape. And he offered it as a generative lesson for students and teachers. Given the persistence of Black people's quarantined educational experiences, the highest calling of Black education continued to be a stealing away from and refusal of the American school's common protocols and curricula. So in this act, I have shared Woodson's first encounters with education. In doing so, I hope to have made clear how anti-Black technologies of control were part and parcel of the American school from its inception. In what follows, I will look more closely at Black people's fugitive practices of learning through Woodson's curricular materials and how teachers use these resources in their classrooms. Act 2, Fugitive Pedagogy and the Black Student as Witness. Tessie McGee taught history during the 1933 school year. She was 28 years old, African American, and a teacher at Webster Parish Training School, the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The state's White Board of Education provided clear instructions. Teachers were to have the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, from which they were to follow closely to ensure that students became acquainted with the targeted learning objectives for history. In a steady, measured tone, Ms. McGee read to her class. But on many occasions, her lessons were not taken from the outline that could be easily spotted on the desk in front of her. Based on her own judgment, she often made necessary revisions by reading passages from Carter G. Woodson's Negro Makers of History, which sat comfortably in her lap. Miss McGee intentionally kept the book out of immediate sight in case someone decided to peek into her classroom while passing by. One of McGee's students during this school year recounted, quote, "She read to us from that book, and when the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk and teach us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap." End quote. Black students were always watching. This one gesture recounted by McGee's student reveals how what was seen, heard, and felt in Black classrooms all affected what students learned. Education extended far beyond what was uttered or written. Students learned from the value systems that shape school routines and the deeds of teachers. Ms. McGee's concealment of Woodson's textbook beneath the desk offers a clear marker of her fugitive pedagogy. The public exposure of the official outline was, in fact, a mass performance of submission to the state's white school authorities. Fugitive pedagogy denotes the hidden transcripts of Black teachers' political motivations as educators and their classroom teachings that explicitly challenge white supremacy. These backstage performances of defiance were often masked by their public performances of compliance to Jim Crow. McGee enacted Black educational heritage. Her embodied subversion was an ethical bend toward its highest political aims. Let us consider for a moment the textbook adopted by the state of Louisiana, which informed the outline McGee was required to read from. There were two textbooks adopted by Louisiana: Modern Times in the Living Past by Henry Elson and An American History by Nathaniel Wright Stevenson. And Louisiana is a textbook adoption state by this time, which many states are moving towards. This means that they are having a standardized curriculum and prescribed textbooks that teachers or school districts are having to follow. So I'm able to go to the school records around this time in Louisiana and identify the textbooks that were adopted and then pull the textbooks to look at the content, right? And so I'll just do a quick read of one of these books, which would have been the 10th grade textbook, and that is Modern Times. In this book, Elson wrote, quote, "Not only are almost all the civilized nations of today of the white race, but throughout all the historic ages, this race has taken the lead and has been foremost in the world's progress," end quote. In transparent fashion, he writes, quote, "Almost the entire book will be devoted to the doings of the Caucasian race, or more specifically, at least 9/10 of the book must be given to an account of the Indo-European branch of the race, as the Indo-Europeans have dominated the world for the past 2,500 years," end quote. Based on Louisiana's adopted curriculum, Tessie McGee and her students were narratively condemned, to borrow from Sylvia Wynter. It deemed them to be of no human concern. And so while we are unaware of the exact passage McGee may have been reading from Woodson's textbook, we at least know what it was negating. And to elevate the significance of Tessie McGee's fugitive pedagogy, I want to invert the scenario and draw your attention to the student as witness. The 16-year-old Jerry Moore, who took note of McGee as she removed her mask of compliance when no longer being surveilled. How, quote, "her eyes went back to the book in her lap," both a figurative and literal hidden transcript. Black students came to understand what it meant to wear the mask, as Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote, through their teachers' fugitive pedagogy. Black educators developed strategic means of acquiescing to the edicts of Jim Crow authority while simultaneously teaching to transgress, thus illuminating the dialectic of Black educational heritage. All the while, Black students were watching them, witnessing. There are three characteristics that drive my analysis of the Black student as witness. First, I underscore that the learning in the classroom went beyond what was spoken or written, but also had to do with meaning and knowledge that was hidden in context, corporeal gestures. Second, I assert that they inherited a critical memory of Black education that taught them how to look at the project of Black schooling. And third, given the shared vulnerability between students and teachers, their witnessing often demanded shared participation. And Angela Davis is a case that brings this to bear. Angela Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944, and the scholar and activist recalled that Woodson's Negro History Week was the highlight of our year. During these commemorative weeks, her teachers instructed students to slam shut and, quote, cast aside the books that did their best to persuade us that our ancestors were much better off during slavery than they would have been had they remained in Africa. And we were allowed then to rely on our own ability to produce knowledge about the conditions surrounding our lives, end quote. Here, Davis underscored that black students were invited to engage in a collective critique of the normative white curriculum in their casting it aside. More than a captive audience, black students were active participants in this fugitive learning practice. And as a slight pivot, I must underscore that the shared vulnerability between teachers and students was a critical factor in this phenomenon of student witnessing. Davis gives language to this in recalling the racialized violence in Birmingham during her childhood, particularly by naming her mother's relationship as a teacher to one of the young girls killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. This event happened after Woodson's death, but it nonetheless speaks to the perpetual threat that black students, teachers, and communities had to reckon with, both in and outside of the classroom. So I want to show a quick clip that illuminates this.
I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again.
So in this clip, the shared vulnerability that Davis highlights, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is, what I'm suggesting, formed a critical context for understanding the acts of subversion that she and other students witnessed and took part in. This was an embodied knowledge informing students' interpretations of their educational experiences. I argue that black students like Davis inherited an oppositional gaze to the American schooling project. This gaze existed well before Woodson's program in the 20th century, but it was framed with a new level of clarity in his educational materials. To be clear, this was not in opposition to learning itself, because there's a number of scholarship in education that suggests that. That's not what I'm saying. This was not in opposition to learning itself. It was a rebuke against the ideas and practices that shaped African Americans' quarantined experiences in education. Stories of black people's historical exclusion from the American school were widespread and developed into a critical black memory, a sort of visual narrative, if you will. This memory was positioned from the standpoint of the black pupil outside the schoolhouse or inside on contingent probationary terms. Writing about black witnessing, Elizabeth Alexander has argued that black people have been looking in, quote, forging a traumatized collective historical memory that is reinvoked at contemporary sites of conflict, end quote. Alexander calls this a practical memory, one that, quote, exists and crucially informs African Americans about the lived realities of how violence and its potential informs our understandings of our individual selves as a larger group, end quote. Given this context, bearing witness in the black tradition has meant more than mere spectatorship, I want to add. Let us recall Frederick Douglass writing about the terrible spectacle of his aunt's violent assault in his slave narrative. Douglass takes care to note that he was, quote, doomed to be both a witness and a participant, end quote. And I should say Douglas's narrative in general offers a lot of generative information to think through this concept of fugitive pedagogy that I've been talking about. But the witnessing that took place in Black classrooms was textured by the shared vulnerability of teachers and students, therefore requiring shared action. Woodson learned this from his first teachers, his formerly enslaved uncles. Jerry Moore recognized this in Miss McGee's classroom as her lesson plan switched with the turning of a doorknob. Angela Davis recounted the intellectual partnership between students and teachers as they engaged in a shared critique of the American school curriculum. These moments hinged on the fugitive reading practice of the known world. On a methodological note, these moments offer a necessary expansion of the historical record to include student voice. Their witnessing allows us to enter into the private spaces of teachers' classrooms, to sit more closely with their pedagogical practices. Thus, Black educational heritage requires that we expand the archive to include accounts of student witnessing through oral histories, critical Black autobiography, and a number of other sources. It has simultaneously stretched the means by which we read this newly expanded archive. So as this act has shown, Black teachers and students engaged in a well-rehearsed dance between compliance and subversion in negotiating their quarantined experience in the American school. Black fugitive practices of learning manifested through intellectual acts and embodied acts that subverted dominant white curricula and school protocols. By intellectual acts, I mean reconstituting what counts as knowledge, inserting Black people into the narrative of human history, and offering explicit critiques of white supremacy. When I say embodied acts of fugitivity, I'm referring to the practical ways that Black people implemented their intellectual ideas, secretly reading from Woodson's textbook, forming organizations as a counterpublic to the mainstream white educational sphere, and performing staged acts of compliance to authority. Staged acts of compliance to authority. So as we transition to the final act, I want to note that these scenarios of fugitive pedagogy were not isolated events. They were more than benign acts of teacher improvisation, and they signify an intricate channel of idea exchange in the professional world of Black teachers, which I'll now turn to. So this final act I'm calling a talk to teachers. Do not hang your head in shame because your face is Black, for yours is a great heritage. Do not teach students away from their environment and leave them suspended in the air, but teach them with a more realistic approach, end quote. Carter G. Woodson made these assertions on many occasions, but on this warm Friday evening in April 1942, the words landed in a particularly powerful way. Over 2,500 delegates of the Georgia Teachers and Educators Association walked up the steps and through the 6 pillars of Sisters Chapel at Spelman College to hear his opening address at their annual conference. In plain language, Woodson declared, quote, "The whole education system as applied to the Negro is wrong," end quote. He criticized popular geography books, representations of Africa in school curricula, and he cautioned teachers against, as he put it, quote, "imitating whites," end quote. Woodson stressed that adopting white theories of education wholesale often obscured critical aspects of the Black condition. He raised this concern on another occasion by recalling one Black teacher who was, as he put it, proud and well-versed in the theories of John Dewey. This theoretical acumen, however, failed to impress Woodson. These theories offered no critical vision for developing the race, no ideas for addressing the anti-Black social policies that circumscribed Black students' lives. Teachers must approach their work through critical study of Black history and culture, Woodson urged, and there needed to be an explicit engagement with structural systems that undermined Black attempts at freedom and justice. This was as basic as any of the fundamentals students were to learn in school. This was their work. There was a pristine aesthetic to Sisters Chapel. Its crisp white walls, mahogany pews and stage, towering pipe organ that served as backdrop all mirrored the beauty and prestige of Spelman College. Black teachers filled this structure beyond capacity. Many teachers stood on chairs outside while leaning their weight against the brick structure and glass windows to listen in. The materiality of the space and its quaint architecture is less important, however, than the atmosphere of purpose and urgency that contoured the bodily experience. It is perhaps this contrast that makes the point most clearly, a contrast that mimics the message Woodson was working to communicate. Treating this space as a revival tent offers a more resonant imaging, a time and space where formal protocols and ceremony are suspended for more immediately demanding matters. What I'm trying to say is that while under ordinary circumstances, standing on chairs outside of this chapel at Spelman College might have been perceived as unbecoming, in this case, purpose trumped etiquette and social comportment. Appearing at this teachers' conference in Atlanta was not atypical for Woodson. He engaged teachers in an ongoing backroom dialogue in these spaces. These types of partnerships empowered teachers to merge information they learned in traditional teacher training pathways with the emerging scholarship and political ideas from the Black intellectual elite. So one might imagine Woodson fervently working in his office at 1538 9th Street Northwest in the historic Shaw District in Washington, D.C. Woodson lived, worked, and died in this building. And from this post, he responded personally to letters written by individual teachers. Some wrote him with historical questions. Others inquired in hushed tones about strategically working to challenge curriculum standards on a local level. Woodson and his small staff mailed textbooks to individual teachers in schools across the country, packaged Negro history kits, and shipped off decorative materials that teachers could use to refashion their classrooms. Interestingly enough, it's during the Depression years that Woodson's educational program expanded most dramatically. After developing an unfavorable reputation amongst white philanthropists by 1930, Woodson would come to rely on the Black masses for the majority of his organization's financial support. Black teachers were at the forefront of this cause. Woodson charged that the reconstitution of knowledge was a critical step in challenging violent assaults against Black humanity. He professed, quote, "There would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom," end quote. Woodson often named this schoolroom lynching duality because it highlighted what was fundamentally at stake. Education was not just about vocational trades, developing more Black professionals, or bourgeois performances of citizenship. It was about insisting on Black social and political life as opposed to death. It meant making legible the social disfiguring of Black humanity that whiteness demands for its propping up, and refusing it through counter readings of the word and world. Pending radical reformation of the American school, Woodson urged Black educators to perform bold acts of defiance. Their vigilance of the American school was a demand of Black educational heritage. So in this act, we see how African American teachers associations sustained the subversive politics of Black education. These institutions were a critical space for analyzing the relationship between the social and material realities of Black life and what was to happen in schools and classrooms. This manifests with an unrelenting clarity as we trace the circulation of Woodson's ideas in and through these organizations. This has charted the direction of my future research, pushing me to reconsider the history of Black teachers associations from their inception in 1861 to the 1960s, when they were forced to integrate themselves out of existence. I've learned that what we remember as the politicized pedagogy and care of Black teachers was not of their own individualized ingenuity. It was intentionally forged in these institutions that grounded Black teachers. I've become increasingly interested in what this history offers for contemporary efforts to recruit and retain Black practitioners. And so I'll close with the words from a eulogy rendered by one teacher for another. In 1963, Albert Brooks paid homage at the funeral of H. Counsel Trenholm, a friend and co-laborer in the struggle for educational justice. Brooks was an educator from Washington, D.C., who helped edit the Teacher's Magazine, Woodson began publishing in 1937. Trenholm served on the executive council of Woodson's association beginning in the 1930s, working tirelessly to introduce Negro life and history in the black schools of Alabama. The words used by Brooks to memorialize his colleague's life captured the phenomenon of fugitive pedagogy I hope to have made clear over the space of this talk. They also illuminate some final concerns about conducting historical research on African American education. Trenholm's career began as a school teacher, and he soon committed his life to building up Alabama State Teachers College in Montgomery, serving as its president from the mid-1920s until he was forced to resign shortly before his death. He was the president and executive director of the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools, a past president of the Alabama State Teachers Association, and an active leader in numerous civic and political organizations. So what I'm trying to demonstrate or represent to you or show to you is that Trenholm in many ways was a representative figure of this intricate professional world that black educators developed to advocate for themselves, their students, and their communities. Therefore, it was fitting when Brooks emphasized how, quote, the Southern tightrope of prejudice caused Dr. Trenholm to show two faces. He was forced to comply with the demands of Alabama's governor, explained Brooks, even as, quote, he devoted a major portion of his time and energy to developing the organizational structure which will eventually destroy the programs of white supremacy, end quote. When laws were passed in Alabama making it illegal to hold membership in the NAACP, Trenholm shared with Brooks that, quote, we will just have to take it underground, end quote. In sharing the good news of a life well spent, Brooks recalled how Trenholm discreetly politicized teachers even as it was strictly forbidden. Thus, as Albert Brooks recalled in this eulogy, critical aspects of black teachers' work took place underground or under a desk, as was the case with Tessie McGee. These fugitive pedagogies of black teachers require that we recalibrate our historical methodologies in order to tell their stories, to access their worlds. This requires an intentional effort to recouple black people's intellectual acts of defiance alongside their embodied experience in the American school, particularly in the private spaces of their classrooms and organizations. This requires the seeking out and preservation of archival sources that exist beyond and beneath formal school records and documents, which are typically called on to tell the stories of black schooling. This is where we locate praxis. Black students' accounts, their witnessing, become critical for gaining access to this knowledge. These methodological terms privilege the human experience at the center of education, and it moves to the interiority of black teachers' and students' worlds, what was happening on the ground, in the flesh, beneath institutional and ideological histories. Black people's spiritual strivings through education are not only accounted for in their writings, they are particularly transparent in their deeds. This is what I understand to be a theory of education carried on the live, performing black body. It's constant negotiation of a quarantined experience in the American school. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarvis. Could you put that last photograph back up, please? You all know whose father that is, don't you? Oh, who? The one who's quoted. Oh, I'm sorry. I could only halfway see it. Albert Brooks is Evelyn's father. I don't know if you all knew that. But that is a very important historical.
Well, I did know that.
I have one question about footnote, which is, where's the quote from, the Woodson quote you started with about being a slave of the mind? Did you say it was from the 19th century?
That quote written by Woodson is a quote directly from the Miseducation of the Negro.
Oh, it is? Oh, okay.
And it's written in a number of different places in newspaper articles leading up to the publication of that book in 1933.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I thought, I misunderstood. I thought you said somehow he had written it in the late 19th century, and I couldn't figure out where he would have done it.
Right.
But here's my question about your, Ms. McKee. I don't know if she was Mrs. McKee or the teacher who, in where I grew up, I started public school in 1956. Schools integrated in my county in West Virginia in 1955. But everybody in my family went to colored schools, and all the principals were black.
Black, yeah.
So But your anecdote implied, I thought, that the principal was white and that she was hiding the book from the principal.
So this is an interesting thing that comes up in a number of cases where you have this staged compliance that I'm trying to talk about, such that even and so in this case, to be clear, the principal is not white. The superintendents of the school that would often visit the school was white, but the principal of the school is a black man, but who had to kind of make sure everything was by the books and on board, because if they were found to be incompliant, they would easily be fired and replaced with someone else. So you have these moments where, and Vanessa Siddle Walker, who's a historian, has been writing about this recently, where even as black teachers and principals know that they're doing other things underground, they still above board are performing this kind of intentional compliance and keeping things in order just in case someone decides to come into the school. For instance, you have these accounts with teachers who are trying to funnel plaintiffs to the NAACP with their litigation, but they can't do this and discuss these things in the school context. Families would come and make complaints, and the principals wouldn't engage the complaints there at all. But they would find other alternative routes to go and meet parents if they felt like they were discreet enough, and then take them other places across town to have these kinds of conversations. What I'm trying to say is that even as this was a black principal, it was understood that there still needed to be this kind of tight ship run at the school just in case you have white surveillance that comes in, right? And so even though the principal is coming into the classroom, the teacher still needs to act as though she's prepared if it was someone else coming into the classroom.
I think that's important for you to make clear, because many people
Would assume the principal was white.
would assume, the
Right.
narrative you set up is a black-white opposition, and it wasn't, which brings me to the point that you said we could raise afterwards, which is the role of white philanthropy in terms of a segregated school and what was emphasized in the curriculum. And we know, of course, money, resources, crucial importance. But we also know that black agency, it's very important that these people weren't just pawns, being moved around the chessboard by white people from Boston and from New York.
Absolutely.
So the relationship between, when you said it was too simple to talk about Du Bois versus Washington dichotomy because of the role of white philanthropy,
Right.
I would say absolutely, but also it would be too simple to make the opposition between white philanthropy and black passivity. There were black people who actually believed in that higher education wasn't good for the Negro at that time. There were a lot of black people who thought that Africans were, if not subhuman, substandard in terms of history of civilization. Black Americans weren't innocent in terms of this.
Yeah, I hear that point, but this is where it becomes tricky for me, is because there are absolutely a number of black people who buy into the industrial education model and think that it's a practical means of moving forward, because in fact it was. You never see this dogmatic perspective, even on Du Bois' side, that no industrial education is important. It's the fact that when you have Rosenwald schools or training schools that are being implemented and saying that this is the only education available, and that when the purse strings start to punish people who decide to step outside of that, for instance, firing principals if they have too many Latin courses in their class at a training high school, even if they're still doing the industrial component, right? And so that's where it becomes tricky, right? So I'm not saying that black people absolutely were not passive. They were well aware of the ways in which these white philanthropists were working to impose their own ideas on what education should look like, right? And we have missionary philanthropists with the AMA, right, who are pushing for a classical style education. They're also a part of this narrative. But then you have the northern white industrial philanthropists who are particularly interested in industrial education and in a very intense way to kind of push out this kind of classical education model. And it becomes very dogmatic, right? And so black people are having to negotiate, well, yeah, some practical education might be fine, but to say that that's the only thing, right, it's never that clean of a break. And I would be hard pressed to find any African-American people who didn't believe that some mixture of classical and industrial education was what was best, right? Even Du Bois's daughter, Portia, not Du Bois, Booker T. Washington's daughter, Portia, he sends her to Fisk, right? Even as he's advocating for this industrial education model in Tuskegee. So it's always a mixed bag, but the way that the philanthropy is working to manipulate the direction of black education is very much so a stronghold, and black teachers on the ground are having to negotiate this because of their precarity. They need the money, right? And so you'll have examples of a principal and a Rosenwald building agent will come to the school and say, what's all this Latin? Why do you have these kids in rural Tennessee learning Latin? You know, if you want this $500 for this new facility, we need to do something about this curriculum. The building agent will come back the next year and he'll ask the principal to bring out the students so that he can see what they've learned in Latin. And the principal says, you know, we've taken that out of the curriculum, and if we introduced it back, the students will probably run home because they're so interested in this industrial work that we've been giving them, right? And that's a moment that comes up in the historical archive of the Rosenwald Foundation. I don't know that this principal is that fully on board with completely wiping out classical education, even as he's performing compliance. And this is how he shows up in this very passive way in the records of the Rosenwald Foundation, right? So I'm trying to, and this is why the fugitivity thing is interesting to me, is because it forces me to talk about black people's agency, but it's always within the strictures of Jim Crow schooling, right? So it's never an overemphasis of this triumphant narrative of segregated schooling was amazing and these teachers did wonderful things. They're constantly having to make certain kinds of concessions, right? And there's still this agency even within the strictures of Jim Crow. Fred Moulton, what he does offer that's useful to me is when he says, escape is an activity, it's not an achievement, right? So there's this constant, like this repeated process.
No, that's interesting, and I didn't know that. What I was referring to was what we might call racial self-alienation. That what Carter, Woodson, and Du Bois and lots of other people railed against, which was the Negro doubting her or his own heritage and its worth, whether it was even worth teaching.
Yeah.
So they had two battles. They had a battle against the system. I mean, Evelyn's father and his boss, Carter G. But they also were fighting within the race. There was a battle. And
Absolutely.
no one was more eloquent about this than E. Franklin Frazier in Black Bourgeoisie about the way that the Negro mind had been colonized.
Yeah, and Woodson writes a critique of E. Franklin Frazier in a review of his book in the Journal of Negro History, right? He says Negroes who have been taken on the ideology of Robert Parks think that they don't want anything to do with the African past and the black savage Negro past, right? He critiques this idea that there's a complete break, as Frazier offers, that there's this complete break from Africa and African American culture, and Woodson critiques that in a review. I think it's of an early essay that's in the Journal of Negro History.
Oh yeah, that goes back to Frazier's battle with Herskovits.
Absolutely.
Right.
And Woodson sides with Herskovits. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and so do we all. Anyway.
So here's my question to you. It's about when you talk about the American school. Okay, before the Civil War in the North, I do think it's important to talk about black agency and then to compare the consequences with after the war, because you mentioned the Boston school case. So that's before the Civil War. That is a really important moment because the black community has been organizing for years before that case ever gets to court.
Right.
And it's a tense situation because they have a black school, the Abiel Smith School. But they feel that they want the right to go to other schools. And so they boycott, they do everything, they take it to court, and they lose. Even with Charles Sumner as their lawyer, and Robert, I'm blanking on his name, the Black Morse, as the black lawyer, but they win. And I always teach this in my class because it's a lesson that even though they lost in the courts had made a decision that it wasn't up to the courts to decide, it was up to the state legislature. And so they mobilized people to vote. And that state legislature is the one that transformed that law. So that black people could go to schools with white people. One of the first, when the Journal of Negro History, when it first comes out, January 1st, 1916, the very first article is called "The Negro Education in Cincinnati," and it's about the work of black and white liberals, if you want to put it,
Yeah.
to get education
Mm-hmm.
for black people in Cincinnati. So I do think it's important to talk about the agency of black people, in that. Okay. But here's the caveat that I want to take it to. When you take, after the Civil War, and when you come up today even, the people who learned in those segregated schools, like you're talking about, they're the people who learned black history. The people who went to those schools in New York City and in Massachusetts in during the Jim Crow era, they didn't learn black history. And today, if you talk to an older person, and that person will say, oh yeah, I know who Crispus Attucks was, and I know who blah, blah. And they'll say, oh, because I learned it in my Louisiana school.
Absolutely.
If you ask somebody who went to, I don't know, some school here in Massachusetts at that same time, they may not even know as much about black people in the Revolutionary War as did that student in Louisiana.
Yeah.
So there's something going on. I mean, what you're saying is really important because they are learning, I mean, to have black pride. One of the things, and I'll stop talking so much, but one of the things that fascinated me so much about the Brown decision is nobody ever asked Carter G. Woodson to give any kind of testimony. Now, I'm talking, I mean, they're fighting these cases well before 1954.
Yeah.
They're not asking Carter G. Woodson to talk about what separate schools mean.
Yeah.
Because it's not inferior. He would have given the wrong side of what that argument should have been. So that's all.
Yeah.
Just as a footnote. Yeah. Piedmont, West Virginia had 2,000 people the year I was born in 1950. Kaiser, West Virginia had 7,500 people. Ridgely, West Virginia, just 10 miles away, had 1,000 people, okay? And so, and the percentage of black people in West Virginia is like 2%, okay? So these were overall percentages. The name of the black school in Kaiser was Lincoln. The name of the black school in Piedmont was Howard, and the name of the black school in Ridgely was Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley. How the hell do Negroes know about Phyllis Wheatley?
Yeah. And this is the Douglas High School in West Virginia that Woodson attended.
Oh, yeah.
And
because
so
he's
this is
big. Carter Woods is huge in West Virginia history.
Yeah, and actually, the naming of schools is something that's super interesting to me, and this is becoming increasingly important as I've been thinking more about Paul Laurence Dunbar's significance to black teachers, is that after Douglas and Booker T. Washington, I'm almost certain that Dunbar is the next most popular name of black high schools.
Other than Lincoln.
And Lincoln, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say in terms of the
Or
names.
Howard, too.
Yeah, but in terms of the namings, it's super interesting. There's also a case in Missouri where there's a group of teachers, and they actually get the school to be named after Toussaint Louverture.
Wow.
And Missouri, and when you look
And
at
then they were all fired. No.
right, it was interesting.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So, yeah, first of all, that was an excellent talk.
Thanks.
Excellent and very important, and I appreciate this work. I especially appreciate your attention toward the end to live performing black bodies, which takes us beyond education as literacy and gives us another way to imagine schooling. In that regard, I want to see if you can tell us something about the content of black education in the era of slavery. Because your story really begins with emancipation, and your story emphasizes the negation of white supremacy in black education. I want to think a little bit more about what's going on in slavery, what black people are teaching each other, and what the content of that education is. And I ask this because I found some years ago in a planter's letter in Jamaica evidence that enslaved people on a Jamaican plantation were teaching Africans who had been newly imported in the early 19th century about slave rebellions that had happened nearly half a century before. And this was very upsetting to him, but it suggests there was an alternative oppositional pedagogy of the enslaved happening on Jamaican plantations where longtime residents had been teaching newcomers about what political education, about what was happening in Jamaica before that. I haven't been able to find many sources like that. I wonder if you have or if you've looked to see what it is that enslaved people are teaching each other in order to, first of all, negate, resist, the depredations of slavery and white supremacy, but also to uphold some traditions, some particular ways of knowing the world, ways of engaging the world that white people didn't have access to.
Right. Thank you for that question. This is also getting to this question that you're bringing out about agency, Professor Higginbotham, to think through this. And so I'm going through my mind. So one of the first things that comes to mind is the Bible. Is absolutely one of the major kind of texts. I mean, because a lot of the educational activities during the context of enslavement is centered around Black religious culture, right? This is why there's this very tight relationship between the history of Black education and the history of Black religious institutions as well, right? So the invisible institution is a site of learning that we have to think about it as such. But in terms of, so there are two things that came to mind when you were initially asking the question. I was thinking the difference between form and content, right? Because I'm not only thinking about what it is that they might have been reading, I'm also thinking about how it is that they're doing their organizing and kind of fashioning a school outside of the school, right? Whether this is in the woods, right? There are these ideas of pit schools, right? People actually going into holes in the ground and lighting a pine torch in the middle of the night to learn, to read sheets of newspapers and things that they may have, or a blue-black speller, right, is one of the things that comes up and is very popular, this popular spelling book during the 19th century that they may have, one of the master's children may have dropped along the way, or they may have borrowed it, right, for some reason. But I'm thinking, in terms of the form that is important to emphasize, is something about communal literacy, which ties to Woodson's narrative as well. So this idea of the ways in which in enslaved communities, literate enslaved people took on this position as kind of community teachers and community leaders in certain kinds of ways, such that if you have one person in the family or in the community that has the ability to kind of decipher the written word, it allows even illiterate enslaved people to manipulate and engage with literate culture, right? So whether this is reading passages from the Bible that then allows people to manipulate and think through scripture, scripture as it relates to their lives, but also scraps from newspapers, right? If they so happen to have gotten their hands on an abolitionist newspaper, there's cases of that. But there are also these oral history practices, right? So George Washington Williams is coming to my mind now when he says the narrative of Nat Turner, right? It was not written in the history books, but it was carved in the fleshly tablets of 10,000 souls who lived in the South, right? Right, and talking about this oral tradition that's being carried on where these stories are being passed on to students, to children in these ways and in communities and circulating. So these are all a part of this, what I would understand to be this, even if not so formal, but still an educational experience that's happening. And there's a book by Thomas Weber called Deep Like the Rivers. And he writes about education in the slave quarter community and how we have to open up our understanding of what schooling means in a structural sense, right? So you have to take these moments of communal literacy important, right? And it becomes important even for Woodson when he's working in the coal mines in West Virginia with illiterate Civil War veterans. They pay him to read Black newspapers to them, right? These are formerly enslaved men who don't have literacy, but they are familiar with the practice of communal literacy, and it becomes important even in that context. So I think that form of communal literacy, there's a theory of education, what learning means is not an individualistic endeavor, right? That is very much so something that translates into how Black people are organizing around education and what comes after, right? So even if the sources are a bit patchy about content, I still think form and the little bit of content that we can have helps us to kind of do some patchwork to think about what this education before the Civil War might have been for enslaved people. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for a superb job, superb presentation. But it strikes me, though, that because the Black freedom movement is an anti-terrorist movement, that we tend to downplay the ideological varieties of the critique of white supremacy. So when I saw critique of white supremacy there as the benchmark of being subversive, I could understand that relative to white supremacist slavery, white supremacist Jim Crow, or white supremacist Jim Crow Jr. But there are conservative critiques of white supremacy. There's liberal critiques of white supremacy. There's radical critiques of white supremacy. There's revolutionary critiques of white supremacy. And if we homogenize those, I think there's a real danger of understanding what we can learn in our present moment from those heroic folk in the past.
Right.
And this is why I think a defense of John Dewey is very important here in regard to Carter Woodson. His radical student, Sheldon Wolin, you know, his book, Fugitive Democracy. It goes hand in hand with your fugitive pedagogy. You see, if you have a critique of white supremacy in an authoritarian classroom with an authoritarian teacher, then you're highlighting one dog when freezing others.
Yeah.
Patriarchy is not hit. You see, homophobia is not hit. Class exploitation is not hit. Empire, imperial policies are not hit. So folk parade around as being subversive with a critique of white supremacy, but they got authoritarian tone, authoritarian temperament, and it goes back to conceptions of education. It's not just the content of the curriculum.
Yeah.
It's the tone, the pitch. It's the temperament of the teacher. A democratic personality in a democratic classroom is not just a critique of white supremacy, it's Socratic across the board, and therefore it opens up possibilities. And so I think, given the magnificent work that you're doing, it's important to capture that as well, so that we don't think that somehow when you say subversive, we're saying something that is crucial, is local, is relative to the vicious terror coming at us, but it's also tied to other kind of dogmatisms, maybe.
Absolutely. Yes.
And that opens us up to subsequent developments of fugitive pedagogy, fugitive democracy, especially in the kind of dogmatic, highly vitriolic and xenophobic and authoritarian crypto-fascist times that we live.
Right. Yeah. And this, and what you're bringing up is something that I've been thinking through recently, is the ways in which different teachers might have put Woodson's ideas into practice, or things that they may have emphasized in one place over another for Negro History Week. For instance, there are cases of schools staging reenactments of the Haitian Revolution during Negro History Week, and that would not have been the case in many other places, right? In other places, you might have just have people talking about school founders or bringing local business leaders in to talk about what they're doing, right? So you even have a very wide range in terms of ideology that these black teachers are subscribing to and how they're implementing Negro History Week, right? So it's not the same, even though there is, there's certainly some difference in the ideological range, but the ways in which they're having to organize, even for basic things like including textbooks, there's almost this bottom line of ways in which they're having to be subversive because of the extreme level of precarity that they're working within. Even if it's like, a very tempered representation of black history in this Webster Parish, Louisiana school, for instance, a couple of years later, Tessie McGee's colleague is run out of town because he speaks back to a man that almost runs him over on his way home from work, right? So he's run out of town. So when we think about the precarity of these teachers, even basic things in terms of trying to change the curriculum, they didn't have the power to do that, because even if they were, because they would just be fired and replaced, right? So yeah, but I appreciate that, and that's something that I'm constantly trying to work through and open up. Thank you for that. Yes.
So I thank you for a really original and insightful paper. I guess I have two questions for you. One is about the broader political implications of Carter Woodson project. The other one is about, I guess, his conceptual sort of dimension of his project. And I guess the first question builds on Professor West's question in this exchange, because I noticed the first slide you showed us about the legislation banning all meetings. It's sort of a month after Nat Turner's insurrection. And, I recognize that people who favor armed resistance are reluctant to discuss it in public. But you did show us the Angela Davis clip, right? And you got from that, or you teased out sort of this idea of kind of oppositional gaze and embodied knowledge. But she also mentioned like armed patrols, So I'm curious to know like just how far you think Carter Woodson goes in his broader political vision, right? He's referring to lynching and things like that. But, we're hearing these series of lectures on liberalism here, and one of the things interesting about liberalism is it brings with it this whole paternalistic infrastructure of apprenticeship and tutelage, this whole developmental horizon that's being carefully managed and controlled and assessed, you know? So do you sort of think Carter G. Woodson subscribes to that, or does he break with that? Does he have a much more ambitious political project that's sort of set in the context of this white efforts to police Black insurgency, or do you know what I mean? So that's the first question. The second one is just, you showed us the myths, the magazines, all these different things that he's part of helping to publish, right?
Right.
And both Langston Hughes and Zona Hurston are research assistants for Carter G. Woodson. And so it's interesting to me, he's always referred to as the father of history because he has an interdisciplinary project, you know, a very kind of multimedia, interdisciplinary project. So I'm curious just to reflect, if you reflect on that, like about his contribution to scholarship, sort of humanities and social sciences, you know?
Yeah, I always think that, I mean, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, I think that life part is oftentimes underappreciated, and I think Woodson was intentional in making it not just the Association for the Study of Negro History, right? Because early on, you have a number of people that are coming to the, you know, the meetings and that are on the board for the organization that are not historians. You have people that are, you know, writing novels. You have people that are artists, right? You know, Paul Robeson, right, and Max Yergin, who are these major kind of political figures at a particular moment that are coming to the conference and talking about the work that they're doing, you know, in Africa. And so, and also, you know, Herskovits is also coming. So it's always more than just history. And I think even Woodson's early work in, you know, collecting letters, you know, and talking about the Negro mind, right, as represented in the letters that they wrote during the time of the crisis of slavery, right? He's always interested in, I think he always understood that in order to tell the story about Black people's experience, lived experiences, requires more than just traditional approaches to history. And he always certainly valued these things, and I think a lot of it has to do with his time as a teacher in the classroom and understanding what this knowledge that they were working to produce meant in terms of how it was going to be put into practice in the lives of students, right? These partnerships between him and artists from the Harlem Renaissance, right? All of the textbook covers, all of the illustrations that are circulated in the Negro history kits, he's partnering with artists from the Harlem Renaissance to try to recreate what a Black learning aesthetic can look like, right? What the Black classroom can look and feel like. And I think these are some of the things that I'm trying to open up and appreciate about what he's doing, because in many ways it's not always clear in his writing, right? He's a very busy person, he's doing a lot, right? And many of these teachers during this time period, they're building, right? They're builders. And these Black people don't have the luxury of sitting down and writing out very long literary prose about their philosophical ideas. And I think sometimes it's incumbent upon us as the scholar to look at what they did right, but also look at what they did and how do we understand their conceptions of the world and the project that they're working to do from these things coupled together, right? This is why I'm trying to emphasize, you know, these acts and and searching for these moments when we can get these windows of opportunities to kind of see how these people are negotiating constraint. To the first part of your question, the first question, forgetting part of it, but I know it's about armed resistance and thinking about how far Woodson would go.
Because, you know, Woodson, he sometimes would turn down grants if he couldn't control the research agenda himself, right? So he privileged autonomy in a very particular kind of way.
You're talking about the conflict between him and Du Bois
not just that. Just mean just like just tease out his political vision, how he saw autonomy and just.
Yeah, so it became this is one of the big falling outs between him and Du Bois. I'm gonna let Professor Higginbotham get in.
People really have to, he was extremely broad, okay? So in 1919, his board, his council, Julius Rosenwald is crucial. In fact, for years, he will say, Julius Rosenwald is the biggest contributor to our movement.
And he was.
So Julius Rosenwald is important to Woodson, okay? Now, at the same time, when he's having meetings, like in the 30s and the 40s, he's got people like Philip Fauner, who are communists, and they're coming to those meetings and they're talking. In fact, if you look at the actual articles that are written in the Journal of Negro History, it's not just Black people, it's white and Black people. And I mean, this is where the early Latin American history is published. This is where the early labor, integration of labor is published. So he is really reaching out to a wide variety of people.
Yeah.
And the final thing about giving up money, I'm not sure how many of these great grants he gave up, but I know one that he really wanted. It was Melville Herskovitz who did him in.
Yeah.
You know, so, and he never, I don't know that he ever lived to know that, but the records have certainly shown it now. That Melville Herskovitz said when he was trying to get the same, I think the same money that Du Bois was trying to get.
Right, for the
He was saying they were just
encyclopedia.
too political.
Yeah.
You needed somebody who wasn't so political.
Right, but
Right.
one last thing that I do want to say this. So this is making, so the miseducation of the Negro comes out when Woodson becomes almost completely disillusioned with white
Absolutely.
philanthropy, right? And it's particularly because of one major incident that happened with the Phelps Stokes Foundation and Thomas Jesse Jones, who Thomas Jesse Jones is the figurehead of black educational philanthropy. And Woodson, Du Bois referred to him as the evil genius of the Negro race. And Thomas Jesse Jones, he didn't like Du Bois and he didn't like Woodson, right? And so, but they decided they wanted to create an encyclopedia on the Negro. And they invited all these black scholars and they said, but Woodson and Du Bois cannot be invited to the table. And so the black scholars, they initially come and they say, well, we can't do this without Woodson and Du Bois. So then they extend the invitation. Du Bois accepts the invitation. Woodson says, I refuse, right? And this becomes a major falling out. And this is a moment when Woodson does kind of choose not to accept the funding. And he says explicitly, because gifts like these should be seen like a gift presented by the Greeks, right? He talked, referencing the Trojan horse reference, right? Is that it's toxic. We know Thomas Jesse Jones. We know the Phelps Stokes Fund. We see what they're doing in colonial education in Africa. They're also the major fundings of black education in the South. Their ideological manipulation of black education is a part of a global structure of white supremacy. He's explicit in that. And this is a moment where he does turn the funding down and where he does have a very incisive critique of white philanthropy and anti-black projects that are global in scale, right? So it does go in ways. But the early part of Asala, Rosenwald, is important, and he is intentional to have a mixed board, right? Black and white, representatives. But by the 1930s, it's pretty much all black. And not only just all black, it's black people that are representing the less prestigious colleges as well. It's the teacher colleges like the, Alabama State Teachers College in Montgomery. It's not the president of Fisk, though he still had representatives and partnerships with people at all of these universities.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, they didn't get the funding. Most was turned down to the encyclopedia, and the funding went to Gunnar Myrdal.
Yeah.
And Herskovitz did them both in. Brandon.
Jarvis, I want to thank you for the presentation. It's really theoretically rich and methodologically innovative, and I'm getting a lot out of it. And I think the discussion shows like that there's so much here. I wanted to go back to something you said to just see if you could expound on it a bit. So one of the things you raised, which was basically an ethical question, was about the teachers knowing that students are also vulnerable to some kind of repression if they engage in these fugitive practices, right? So that on one hand, it creates some sense of solidarity because we're both vulnerable to sanction or other kinds of violent repression in the case of Michael's question. And I'm wondering, are you finding anything from Woodson or other educators in particular that speaks more at length about the crisis this must cause for them as a sense of vocation? So on one hand, you got your role as a teacher is in part to protect students from these kind of horrible consequences. Many people conceive of it as kind of in loco parentis, where they're under your care. I mean, you're trying to act as almost a parental figure, but your pedagogy is subjecting them to making them vulnerable to forms of terror and repression that you can't possibly prevent. So I'm just curious as to how people are working through that ethical dilemma. I know it's a big thing that comes up in civil rights protests, where you're like, do you put the kids out there to integrate to school knowing that they're going to be subject to violence? But this is a whole new way of thinking about it that I hadn't heard much about before. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more.
Could you take the last question
And then answer both? Absolutely. Thanks,
Sure.
Reverend.
And thank you, Dr. Givens, for such a rich speech. I'm trained in ancient Greek and Latin literature, so I have a lot of word plays that I can talk about with you at a separate time. But my question is really about Africa, because you're talking a lot about education in America, but as you mentioned, the Phelps-Stokes Act and Commission in 1926, there's a lot going on the continent. I'm thinking about Marcus Garvey as well. And I'm really curious to know where Carter G. Woodson stood in terms of education on the continent, because his books are very rich in terms of thinking about Negro history, but I wonder in Liberia, in Ethiopia, in countries that are at the forefront of independence in the 20th century, I wonder how he's communicating, if at all, with leaders there, people who are thinking about education when it's not just the British or the French anymore who are in charge.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. To your point, it's I appreciate the question because it's really complicated to write about these different things that they're negotiating in different moments in different spaces, right? But one of the things that became obvious to me is that students were aware of their teachers' vulnerability, right? That's why I wanted to, this idea of shared vulnerability is something that black students are aware of. It's not foreign to them, right? They know what it means when the white superintendent comes into the school and into the classroom, right? There are pictures from the Rosenwald Foundation. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do with them. But you have these images of these, white male superintendents coming into these little rural schools. It's oftentimes a black woman teacher, or sometimes it's a male teacher, and students are there, and he's peering over the class from the back, and they're taking a picture of the class to capture the modern architecture that Rosenwald is helping to develop in these southern schools. But there's ways in which you get to see the familiarity with these power relations, both in the students' eyes, but also in the teachers' eyes, right? And so I say that to say that the teachers are both aware that there's only so much protection that they can provide for the students. Similarly, the students understand that their teachers are also vulnerable to white people, right? And they see this happening all around them. And there are examples that in some of the student accounts, for instance, even in Angela Davis's autobiography, she talks about one encounter going with her principal somewhere, and all the seats are taken and the students are sitting down, and the superintendent says, well, boy, you can sit here on the floor, right? And the teacher says, no, I'm not going to sit on the floor, I'll just stand. He stands the entire time for the entire session in the back. But these are moments that students see, and that it's this visual narrative, this collective shared memory that I'm saying that they know that comes to bear in how they interpret these moments. For instance, when the teacher is hiding something that she's not supposed to be doing, right? Or even when it comes to voting, right? When it's illegal for black people to attempt to vote in the world, when elections are happening, they're having students practice democracy in the schools, even though the world around them is violent to this very act from black people, right? So they're preparing them for a world that's yet to exist. And then we see what happens when it comes to, for instance, the Children's March in Birmingham, right? In these moments when you have the teacher turning to write on the board to kind of act like she doesn't see the students jumping out the windows and running out of the doors, right? So it's always negotiating these things. Sometimes teachers will say, it's too risky, I'm not going to push too far, right? Maybe we shouldn't have students perform reenactments of the Haitian Revolution, right? Other places, they're like, absolutely, it's necessary for this to happen. So it really runs the gamut. To this question, thank you for that question, because one of the things that has become so interesting to me is the moment that Woodson is becoming isolated from white philanthropy. The first break comes when Woodson critiques the Phelps-Stokes Fund for blocking Max Yergin's passport in order to get to South Africa, because he's seen as a rebel rouser in South Africa, the work he's doing with the YMCA. Woodson writes a letter publicly about it. Thomas Jesse Jones does not like it. And so he goes on this letter writing campaign for all the white philanthropists to stop funding Woodson, right? So this is initially when Woodson's eye, I think, starts to become particularly attuned to the way in which the white philanthropy he's critical of in the Jim Crow South is connected to colonial education in Africa as well. The Phelps-Stokes Fund puts out an annual report on education in Africa, where they talk about the missionary educational projects that are happening there, et cetera, et cetera. Woodson writes a scathing review of it and publishes it in the Journal of Negro History. Fast forward, and he's always having contact with people, for instance, Casely Hayford, who was a very important kind of Pan-Africanist. And from the Gold Coast, you see letters exchanged between him and Woodson, Casely Hayford saying that he's writing reviews of Woodson's scholarship, abroad, and you have people from Liberia, but also the Gold Coast writing to Woodson, attempting to start a chapter of Asala in West Africa, right? So you always see these exchanges. There's one teacher in Alabama I'm super interested in. His name is Akiki Inyabongo, and he was a prince from Uganda actually, but was teaching in the laboratory school in Montgomery, Alabama through the Alabama State Teachers College. And he's writing to Woodson, he's teaching students, and he had a PhD from Oxford, but he's teaching students about sub-Saharan African culture. He was an anthropologist by training. He's teaching them songs in different languages, and he's talking about exposing students to a more kind of expanded and capacious vision of Africa than just kind of fetishized idea of like the dark Africa and the dark continent. So you see Woodson always engaging with people and learning and trying to loop this into his program that he has on the ground here in the US. So this diasporic exchange is central to his thinking and his educational project. And I don't think that many scholars give these early black thinkers credit for their kind of global perspectives around blackness, right? It wasn't just fetishized idea of Africa. They were struggling. Obviously, sometimes people are getting it wrong and it's problematic, but then you also have other times when you see this sincere struggle to try to expand this perspective, and it's particularly through these kind of struggles, right? And for Woodson, it was through education.
Let's thank Jarvis for one.
That was great. Hey, appreciate it.
Can't wait. When's your book out?
Send it to the publisher end of next month. So we don't have to talk about resistance on the mic.
For the record. Oh, you should come to lunch. You should come to lunch. Lunch at the 104 Mount Auburn. And then obviously, like, we're skipping. That would be great.